In a world of rigid borders, some stories cannot be contained. This is Of the World, Chronicles of Civilization. Today, we witness the final act of the most destructive conflict in human history, a titanic assault by 2.5 million Soviet soldiers against a crumbling capital defended by old men and children, where the last fanatical remnants of the Third Reich fought amid rivers of fire and mountains of rubble as the 1,000-year empire collapsed in 12 apocalyptic days. This is the fall of Berlin. By April 1945, Adolf Hitler's Third Reich was a corpse that had not yet stopped moving. The Western Allies, American, British, Canadian, and French forces, had crossed the Rhine and were sweeping through Western Germany. But it was from the east that annihilation came. The Red Army, battle-hardened through 4 years of the most savage warfare the world had ever seen, stood on the banks of the Oder River, barely 60 kilometers from the heart of Berlin. Behind them lay a trail of vengeance carved across Eastern Europe, through the ruins of Warsaw, the ashes of Budapest, the rubble of Königsberg. Ahead of them lay the capital of the nation that had invaded their homeland, besieged Leningrad for 872 days, and slaughtered 27 million Soviet citizens. This was not merely a military operation. For Marshal Georgy Zhukov, for Marshal Ivan Konev, and for every soldier in the Red Army, Berlin was personal. This was the reckoning. April 16, 1945, 3 o'clock in the morning. Darkness over the Oder-Neisse line. Then the world exploded. Over 40,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, the largest bombardment in the history of warfare. In the first 30 minutes alone, more than 500,000 shells tore into the German defensive positions along the Seelow Heights, the last major fortified ridge between the Oder and Berlin. As the barrage lifted, Zhukov ordered 143 anti-aircraft searchlights switched on, blazing across the floodplain to blind the defenders. But the Germans held. General Gotthard Heinrizi had anticipated the bombardment, pulling his frontline troops back. The charging Soviet infantry were cut to pieces by fire from the heights. For 3 days, the heights held. Under Stalin's pressure, Zhukov threw division after division into the meat grinder. Over 30,000 Soviet soldiers fell, but force prevailed, and on April 19th, the heights broke. The road was open. While Zhukov battered through the front door, Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front swept around from the south in a massive flanking maneuver, crossing the Spree River and driving north toward Berlin's southern suburbs. By April 25th, the two Soviet fronts linked up west of the city. Berlin was encircled. 3.5 million people, soldiers, civilians, refugees who had fled westward from the advancing Red Army, were trapped inside a ring of steel and fire. On the same day, at the town of Torgau on the Elbe River, American and Soviet patrols met for the first time. The handshake on the broken bridge was photographed and transmitted around the world. Germany was cut in two. Inside the encirclement, the situation was beyond desperate. The Berlin garrison, a patchwork of shattered Wehrmacht divisions, Waffen-SS fanatics, elderly Volkssturm militia conscripts, some as old as 60, and Hitler Youth boys as young as 12, was ordered to defend the capital to the last breath. Many of these defenders had never fired a weapon before they were handed a Panzerfaust and pointed toward the approaching Soviet tanks. The battle for Berlin was Stalingrad in reverse, but this time, it was the Soviets storming a ruined city, block by murderous block. The defenders used every tactic the Soviets had perfected at Stalingrad. They fortified apartment buildings and turned subway tunnels into defensive positions. They flooded the subways to deny the Soviets underground routes of advance, drowning wounded soldiers and sheltering civilians. Soviet assault groups, organized into combined arms teams, advanced through the mouse hole tactic, blasting through interior walls of adjoining buildings to avoid the killing zones of open streets. When they encountered a fortified position, they brought up heavy artillery and fired point blank at ranges of 200 meters or less. By the final week, Berlin was a burning labyrinth of shattered masonry and cratered streets, shrouded in a permanent pall of smoke and dust. For the Soviet command, one building mattered above all others, the Reichstag. Though the Parliament building had not been used for governance since the Nazis set it ablaze in 1933, it remained the supreme symbol of German state power. Stalin had declared that the Soviet victory banner must fly from its roof. Zhukov assigned the honor to the 3rd Shock Army's 150th Rifle Division. On April 30th, Soviet assault teams reached the Reichstag's battered facade. The building was defended by a garrison of approximately 1,000 SS troops, barricaded behind concrete, sandbags, and water-filled anti-tank ditches. The fighting to breach the entrance was ferocious, room by room, staircase by staircase, with grenades, submachine guns, and bayonets. At approximately 10 o'clock in the evening on April 30th, Sergeants Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, a Russian and a Georgian, climbed to the roof of the shattered Reichstag and planted the Soviet victory banner, a red flag bearing the hammer and sickle. The photograph of that moment, the banner rippling over the broken skyline of Berlin, flares and smoke rising behind it, became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Fighting inside the building continued for another 2 days, but the symbol was complete. The Red Army stood atop the citadel of its enemy. 55 feet beneath the ruined Reich Chancellery Garden, in a cramped concrete bunker vibrating with the concussion of Soviet shells, the man who started it all was preparing to die. Adolf Hitler had retreated into the Führer bunker in January. By late April, he was a physical ruin, trembling, stooped, raging at imaginary armies and ordering counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed. Learning that Heinrich Himmler had secretly attempted to negotiate surrender, Hitler's fury was volcanic. He ordered Himmler's SS liaison officer shot in the Chancellery Garden. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony. He then dictated his political testament, appointing Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor. On April 30th, at 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to his private study. She took cyanide. He shot himself. Their bodies were carried to the garden, doused in gasoline, and burned. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years, 3 months, and 9 days. With Hitler dead, the remnants of the Reich crumbled. On May 1st, General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense area, attempted to negotiate a ceasefire. General Vasily Trikov, the same man who had commanded the defense of Stalingrad, received the German delegation. The symmetry was staggering. On May 2nd, Weidling formally surrendered the Berlin garrison. Over 135,000 German soldiers laid down their arms within the city. The shooting in Berlin stopped, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence that survivors would describe as almost more terrifying than the bombardment. But the war was not yet officially over. Pockets of resistance continued across Europe. German forces in the West raced to surrender to the Americans and British rather than face Soviet captivity. Finally, in the early hours of May 8, 1945, in a nondescript military school in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst, General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German Armed Forces High Command, signed the unconditional instrument of surrender before representatives of the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. When asked if he understood the terms, Keitel answered simply, yes. The Second World War in Europe was over. The Battle of Berlin consumed the last reserves of two empires. The Soviet Union suffered approximately 81,000 killed and 280,000 wounded in the final assault. Germany's losses are harder to calculate. An estimated 100,000 German soldiers and militia were killed defending the capital, while tens of thousands more simply vanished in the ruins. But it was the civilians who paid the most terrible price. Between bombardment, starvation, suicide, and the widespread atrocities committed during and after the Soviet occupation, an estimated 100,000 Berlin civilians died. The city itself was nearly annihilated. 70% of Berlin's buildings were damaged or destroyed. The population, which had been 4.3 million before the war, had fallen to fewer than 2.8 million, hollowed out by evacuation, conscription, and death. The fall of Berlin did not merely end a war, it ended an age. The Europe that emerged from the rubble of May 1945 was unrecognizable from the continent that had existed 6 years before. The old colonial powers were shattered. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other across a devastated continent, and the Cold War, the ideological confrontation that would define the next half-century, was already taking shape in the ruins. Berlin itself became the Cold War's most dangerous fault line. Within 4 years, the city was divided. Within 16, a wall cut it in two, a concrete scar that would stand for 28 years as the most visible symbol of a world split between East and West. The soldiers who fought their way into Berlin, Soviet, German, and the civilians trapped between them, carried scars that never fully healed. The generation that survived the battle lived with memories that defied language. The sound of Katyusha rockets, the smell of burning phosphorus, the silence after the last shell fell. What Berlin taught the world at a cost of millions of lives in blood and fire and unimaginable suffering is that the machinery of conquest, once set in motion, will not stop until it consumes the civilization that created it. This has been Of the World, Chronicles of Civilization. The guns have fallen silent, but the stories never will.